What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Floyd Street's Finest. I am your host, Jeff Greer. Super excited to be here with you after a little bit of a break. I think everybody needed some time off after the old 4-28 campaign that was this past season. But as you can see, if you're watching this on the stream, we are joined by Mike Rutherford. Mike, thrilled to have you here. But before we get into our conversation today, I just want to mention real quick, for the off season, you got to make sure to check out the Field of 68 Media Network. There's so much content. Just saw the other day, they're starting to get into the MTE game, which is just mind blowing to me to think where this thing started to see where it is now. But make sure you check out the array of podcasts and shows across the network. There's so much good stuff. And we're really thrilled to be a part of it. So, Mike, it's a heavy week in Louisville. I don't know how much more Louisville it could get than you go from the Kentucky Derby and the build up to the Kentucky Derby to spending some time remembering the legend who is Denny Crum. He passed away this week. By the time this episode comes out, we will be the day of the celebration of life for Denny, which is at 7 p.m. Monday night at the Yum Center, right, Mike? I just want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah.
Yum Center. So, but Mike, I know you and I both have had interactions. We've got lots of different stories about Denny, especially for a kid growing up here who is as Louisville basketball as it gets for you. First, when the news hit, what was your reaction, I guess, when you first found out that he had passed on?
I think it was just, I mean, it's one of those things that you hate to say it like this, but you know it's coming at some point in the relatively near future when somebody reaches a certain age and it's harder to have failing health. Denny's had a couple of strokes. There'd been the rumors like 4 or 5 months ago, I think it was in December, that something bad was going to happen. He was not doing well, and thankfully that ended up not being 100% true. But when you actually hear it, I mean, it's like any other experience with grief in your life. You can prepare yourself for it, but when the moment actually comes, it's still a complete gut punch. It's still one of those things where your heart drops a little bit, and you react to it the best you can. It's a sad, very sad moment for everybody involved with Louisville basketball, everybody who followed Louisville basketball, certainly people who knew and loved Denny. It doesn't make it any easier to know that it was imminent. It was definitely one of those things where Crum became a figure in my life, especially since he was still omnipresent with Louisville basketball after his retirement, where it got to the point where you just can't really envision things without him. You know, he's right. Always going to be at the Yum Center. He's always going to be given that sly smile when they show him up on the big screen at games. And so it feels, and I know that other people have had this experience with death, whether it's personal or somebody you admired as a public figure. It felt wrong. It feels wrong to go on without him, even though this wasn't one of those deals where it was a shock and he was a 41-year-old who this came out of nowhere. It still just feels like Denny was going to be around forever. I know people used to say that about Dick Clark. He kind of was like Louisville's Dick Clark. You know, you never really knew exactly how old he was. You just always expected to see him at the Derby, see him at games, see him around town, see him pop up in pictures with friends and all that stuff. And now that he's not, it just feels wrong. And that was kind of my initial thought in this whole thing.
Yeah, and of course you immediately think of for me from the interviews over the years, from different teams that he's had, different players he's had over the years, and obviously talking to family and friends too. That's what it always hits me, and to add a personal element to it, as a way of trying to connect on an empathetic level. You know, when your grandparent passes away and they've lived a full life and they get to the point that they're pushing 90, and I know Denny was 86. They've lived a long time. They've lived a great life. They've impacted a lot of people. I mean, Denny has impacted just about as many people in this community as anyone. I would think you could put him right up there on that list. it's a celebration of their life, and I know it's you feel for the people around Denny, who if you hear Kenny Payne talk about him or any of those guys who played for him in the 70s and 80s, obviously his teams in the 90s too, they will talk about almost viewing him like a father figure to them. And you know, you hear that about coaches time and again. Um, but when you listen to how the relationships were formed, it really hits hard for you to know that that's not just a former athlete talking the way former athletes talk. That's a legitimate, heartfelt, authentic feeling about Denny Crum that they had about their coach. So from that standpoint, that hit me, knowing that it was sad. Like when my grandparents have died, I was sad for my parents. I was sad for my aunts and uncles. And so when that news hit the other day, I had a similar reaction where it's, you know, Denny has lived this incredible life. We can celebrate Denny's life, and you feel for the people around him who revered him and adored him and loved him so much. Uh, Mike, when you think about Denny Crum, and I know you mentioned sort of that omnipresence around the program, and all the times that I talked to him, like on a game day, where it'd be like, okay, yeah, I need to actually I'm going to go to dinner and then go to the game. Like, still, I mean, 2 decades into the 2000s, the guy was still going to games. Um, you mentioned the sly grin, the swagger level of Denny Crum, off the charts. I mean,
Yeah.
his swagger could last you all the way to Pluto. Um, in your view, like, where did that come from? And I guess how much do you think that swagger and the way he carried himself through a time where swagger really started to kind of pop in sports, how much do you think Denny's swag helped Louisville become a program that had a swagger about it? I mean, and has for a while, and obviously it transitioned with Rick Pitino. But how much do you think his individual personality and that swagger kind of made up what the Louisville profile was when he was the coach, and even past that?
It was a huge part of it. And I think that, you know, I grew up, I always kind of felt bitter when I was really coming of age as a Louisville fan, because I basically, I missed the 80s, you know, this dominant period where Louisville basketball makes the ascension from upper echelon program to like perennial national powerhouse. They, you know, the team of the 80s, according to Sports Illustrated, 4 Final Fours, 2 national titles. Like, I basically missed all that. I was one when we won the national title in 1986. And so when I started finding out about their history when I was becoming a big time fan in the 90s, I'm like, well, you know, what the hell? Like, I think that was cool. Glad my dad and my brothers got to experience it. I didn't really get to see any of that. So the Denny that I fell in love with it in the mid to late 90s was definitely a different figure than the one that got here in the 70s and in the 80s. And that's normal. It's understandable. People change over time. He certainly had swag in the 90s and the early 2000s and then later in his life. But one of the things that was so cool about going back when I was doing the book a few years ago and looking at stories from the 1980s and from the 1970s was seeing some of the quotes where you were just like, damn, like this guy was just putting it out. Like this guy had no problem saying some stuff. Like, Louisville fans love the video of him with John Teshi before the 1983 Dream Game, where they show him talking about, you know, they have the video of Tesh interviewing Joby Hall and grilling him on, like, you know, why won't these teams play? And Joby Hall like tries to stop the interview and try to walk out, and then he relays that story to Denny Crum, and Crum is like, well, that's typical. Like, just like gives him the whole like thing. I love the quote. I found it. He was talking about, you know, he was one of the modern guys when it came to the modern philosophy of scheduling really difficult games in November and December, not being, I mean, you know, Louisville's 2 national title teams were not 1 seeds, and he very rarely had a 1 seed. I think 83 may have been the only one, because they would take their lumps in November and December, but he believed that it would build his teams into the best position for being successful in March. And he got asked about, I got the quote here. He got asked about this before the 1986 title game, his philosophy. And he said, I could arrange a patsy schedule, win 30 games, and be coach of the year. But as a coach, I feel secure about myself. I'm not worried about keeping my job. I'm more concerned with us being the best team we can be at the end of the year every year. If we played a patsy schedule, we wouldn't be here. I don't get paid to be coach of the year. I get paid to get Louisville as far as we can go each year, which I thought was awesome. I
What
mean,
a great quote.
the man is basically like, yeah, all these, that guy over there who's 30-2 and is going to win Coach of the Year. Cool. You've got a gaudy record, a glistening record. We're going to go farther than you in the NCAA tournament. He definitely had a swagger, and I do think it played a huge part in elevating Louisville to the next level. And a big part of that was him calling out Kentucky. John Clay wrote a really good thing this week saying if Denny Crum doesn't come along in the 1970s, Louisville, Kentucky might still not be playing on an annual basis. Like they may still, or this thing could have drug on until the 90s where Kentucky just didn't want to play. Like he essentially forced Kentucky to recognize them and then start playing them on an annual basis. And if he wasn't so brash, I don't know if Louisville winning at the level that they were winning at wouldn't have been enough. Like he was willing to call out people. He was willing to, have the swagger on the sidelines. And it definitely was a huge part of why Louisville became, what they are today.
Yeah. And you mentioned that quote and one of my all time favorite things that I got to do when I did the oral history of the 1986 team was go back through the old Courier Journal clips from the 80s and read, like, Russ Brown is like sitting in his office and just like shooting the shit with Denny Crum, and Denny just like fires him off like right and left. And the thing is like, I'm looking at some of these lines that he has, but like the thing that made Denny, I think that got him the respect that outside of winning and obviously being an incredible tactician, a great coach, was if his team stunk, he told you they stunk.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to say it was my fault. He wasn't afraid to say what went wrong and take responsibility for it. And there's so many examples of it, of him just kind of shooting from the hip.
Can I say real quick?
Yeah.
One of the before you read that quote, like one of the reasons I knew that Louisville was in trouble last year was I had a friend who went to an early practice with Denny Crum, and I won't mention the name because I'm sure they don't want me to give that away. But he said that Denny used the word "sucks" to describe what he was watching at practice, and I was like, well, if Denny Crum is saying it sucks, that's probably not a good sign of things to come. So Denny knew. I think Denny has high hopes certainly for Kenny Payne moving forward, but Denny knew that this past season was probably not going to be a wild success after seeing practice and saying that it sucked.
I mean, that's incredible.
Great.
But that's swag. I mean, that's like, you don't care.
He's call it like it is.
Yeah. But I'll go to this example here because it's a really funny little side story. Russ Brown. I don't think Russ Brown gets enough credit around here for writing his writing style. I know this is a very esoteric thing to be talking about, but if you're going to talk about 80s Louisville, Russ Brown is chronicling them at the big newspaper at the time.
Russ is great.
Incredible. But they're taking on in the second round of the 86 tournament. They're playing the 7th seed the Bradley Braves. Okay, 32-2. Jim Les and Hersey Hawkins are on this team, ranked as high as 9th through the course of the season in the AP poll. Their coach Dick Versace was described by Russ Brown as a dapper guy with silver hair and a silver-tongued vocabulary. And then the writing is, it's a good thing Crum is meeting Versace on the court and not over a Scrabble board. But the reason I bring up that as kind of the context here is I guess Herbert Crook did not have a good game, and they ended up winning 82-68, but he didn't play well. And Denny tells the story here. I thought we beat them fairly easy on the airplane coming back. I'm sitting on the aisle up front, and Herbert Crook comes down and kneels next to me and says, "Coach, I owe you an apology." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "I've played like a dog in this tournament." I knew he hadn't played well, but I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. In the first 2 games, Crook had averaged 8 and 4, 8 points, 4 rebounds. Next 4 games, he had 16 and 10 over the final 4 games in the tournament. And according to Denny, shot about 75%. And I will never forget just hearing little anecdotes about that, about guys who felt the need to go talk to him and say, "Hey, I owe you better than what I gave you." And that was not the only example of it. But that's an open dialogue coach. That's a coach who has the respect of his guys, who know that they need to play better if they're not playing better. But they want to win for him, and they want to execute the way he wants them to execute. Because that speaks volumes for what type of coach he is, that a guy would come over and say that to him. I think. But Mike, I wanted to throw one other thing at you. Are there any what ifs for you with Denny? And I'm not trying to trivialize his legacy or anything like that. But you mentioned earlier, a little bit of resentment, being one of the younger folks growing up, knowing what the 80s had been like. Are there any what ifs that you experienced as a Louisville fan with Denny? I assume it's probably more related to the 90s teams that he had, and he had some good ones in the 90s, that you kind of still think about as far as Louisville basketball just in general?
There's one huge one that I think every Louisville fan still thinks of, and this was beaten into. I think there are like three things that were beaten into the head of every kid around my age who had dads that were growing up as big UofL fans. The first was, Houston only lost to NC State in the '83 title game because Louisville tired them out in the Final Four. Like they
Yeah,
always
I
say
love
that.
that.
Every dad always hammered that point home. Two, yeah, two. Rodney McRae was basically like Hercules. Like he could have beaten anybody up in the entire world. Like the dads love Rodney McRae. And then three is, if Wade Houston hadn't left, if you hadn't lost Wade Houston to Tennessee and Allen Houston to Tennessee, Denny Crum would have won more national titles here. Like the 90s would have gone better. There wouldn't have been the bad years down the stretch. You wouldn't have had to have gotten forced out. I think that's the biggest what if in Denny Crum's tenure, is if he'd been able to keep Wade, if he'd been able to bring Allen to Louisville, with the good times of the 80s kept rolling on in the 90s. And I think that's the big what if. But he did seem to. Louisville started recruiting more poorly down the stretch in the 90s. You mentioned that player respect. I remember watching games where like former players would come and they'd yell at the current players because they're like, "You've got a Hall of Fame coach and you're not listening to
That's
him."
crazy.
It definitely took on a different feel in the late 90s. Yeah. It got bad down the stretch. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, an incredible legacy. And you mentioned Wade Houston. What a guy to talk to about Denny, and some of the memories in the trenches that they were in together. Good God, those guys experienced a lot at the height of college basketball for that program at the time, and got some really good players. I mean, got some really, really, really good players. And I mean, the list is just incredible of the players they brought in and coached and worked with. And I always thought it was interesting. I can't remember who said it and who they were talking about. So this is a very vague reference. But I did I wrote a story about the L's Up, the history of the L's Up. And I remember one player, just as an aside, was describing another teammate in the 80s. It would have been the 87 team. How they were the type of guy who needs everything explained to them. So like they need to understand why Denny Crum is asking them to do X, Y, and Z. And it was kind of like you're going to get your butt kicked if you don't figure things out quickly, my guy. But like the coaching staff worked with the player, and I can't remember who it was. So this is a really helpful anecdote, but I do think it's interesting that a good coaches, to me, and great Hall of Fame coaches, in Denny Crum's case, figure out ways to communicate and deliver their message to different ways of learning and different ways of grasping things. And I think that's something that we're learning as a society now. And you hear that now a lot more in college football, college basketball, about coaches trying to figure out different ways to get messages across to their players, and they bring in sports psychologists and all that. But I always thought that was interesting that someone could be that far ahead of the conversation, at least when it was a public thing that people were talking about, that Denny could grasp, like, hey, we need to work hard with this specific guy to make sure that he understands what's going on. I think that's pretty sweet.